Capital City Sunday.
We are 9 days away from the August primary election. Voters will have to decide whether to pass or reject two constitutional amendments that could potentially change how federal emergency funds are allocated in the state. Voting rights coalitions argue if passed, they would delay federal relief in emergency situations, but those in favor of the two amendments say allocating federal dollars deserves increased legislative oversight. Grace Hodek gives us a deeper look into what's at stake.
These two referendum questions, according to political science expert Howard Schwaber, are not the easiest to understand.
Both of these referendum provisions are written in such general and vague terms about such technical questions.
The first question has to do with delegation of appropriation power,
which is the one that would create a constitutional amendment preventing the legislature from delegating its authority over expenditures to the executive.
The second question is regarding the allocation of federal monies.
It appears to require both houses of the Wisconsin state legislature to approve any allocation of those federal funds. And in the situation of an emergency, that could obviously hold up the process very considerably or even stymie it.
Schwaber says both referendums can be interpreted in several different ways and says it's unreasonable to expect voters to know what's at stake.
This looks like an effort to erase executive discretion, which would be truly radical, truly contrary to basic constitutional principles. And so when you ask, how would I rewrite this referendum question, the answer is I would not allow a question of this importance and this complexity to be in a referendum in the first place.
In short, both measures are about giving the legislature more power to limit a governor's ability to spend money. Schwaber says he expects them to pass.
They're being considered in a very low turnout primary election, which traditionally favors Republican voters. The one thing voters know about these provisions is that they're favored by Republicans and disfavored by Democrats.
Joining me on the show this morning is Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty President Rick Esenberg. Rick, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me on.
Rick, your organization is calling on voters to vote yes on two constitutional amendments that will be on the August primary ballot this year. Why do you think there should be additional provisions in the way that the governor uses his process to allocate federal emergency funds?
Well, I think it's encapsulated in the way that you said it. What these amendments do is make clear that the governor cannot allocate these funds unilaterally. The amendments are about democracy. They're about checks and balances on the concentration of power. And all they do is make clear that the people's elected representatives in the Senate and Assembly also have a say on how these monies are to be distributed. And in doing that, it is consistent with our Constitution's separation of power. The legislature makes the law, it appropriates funds. The governor executes the law, and these amendments make clear that that applies to federal money, which is taxed from the taxpayers of Wisconsin, sent to Washington, returned. Our democracy requires that our legislators also have a say in how that money is to be spent.
Do you feel there were circumstances where emergency funds were previously misused that would call for these two referendum questions to be on this year's August primary ballot?
Well, I'm certain that people on both sides of the aisle will have disputes about how these funds are to be allocated. There are people who, have accused Governor Evers of using the money to advance his political ends. And I am sure there are people on the other side of the aisle that would make the same allegations against Governor Walker. This is not a partisan amendment, although people may try to frame it that way. Even if you love what Governor Evers did with the COVID pandemic funds, there will be, I guarantee you, another governor in the future who you will not like as well. And so we ought to agree that that much power should not be concentrated in one set of hands.
And I want to go back to your point about these two referendum questions not necessarily being a partisan issue. What do you have to say to those opposing these two potential constitutional amendments that argue it would keep the governor from moving quickly to distribute emergency funds in crisis situations such as what occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, there are other provisions in the law that govern what the governor can do under emergency situations, and those wouldn't be altered by this. But what's important to keep in mind is that because there's an emergency doesn't mean that we suspend our democracy. Our democracy is perhaps more important than ever when we're faced with a difficult situation. We want broad public input. When the COVID pandemic hit in March of 2020, there was a bipartisan COVID relief bill that was passed in the legislature in April. And so I don't think there's any reason to believe that our political leaders will be irresponsible in the face of an emergency. What these amendments do is make clear that when we respond to emergency, when we respond to non-emergencies, at least when the initial crisis is over or is passed, or we have time to return to regular constitutional order, that we do that the legislature makes the law, that the governor executes the law. Certainly, the governor has a veto power, and that we make these important decisions in accordance with our constitutional democracy.
Rick Esenberg, Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty president. Rick, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you very much for having me.